Afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Tara Raghavan. I'm the president of SABA North America, and I'm very, very excited to welcome all of you to this program and also introduce our chair of the Racial Justice Task Force, Tarina Mand, who's also going to be able to introduce our talk about our co-sponsors and talk about how this program came about. And then we'll get started right away with the conversation between Arti and Thenmozhi. Tarina?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tarina Mand. I'm chair of the Racial Justice Task Force for SABA North America. Thank you all for joining us this evening to learn about this important topic on caste. First, I would like to introduce you to your host this evening, Arti Ferreira. Arti is the senior deputy at the City Attorney's Office in San Jose. She's a workers' compensation and employment law attorney where she's been practicing law for 10 years. Her passion for social justice and equity led her to join the Racial Justice Task Force. She says she enjoys traveling around the world with her husband and 2 boys and hopes that they can see beyond their privilege and use their voices to speak up in the face of injustice against all oppressed peoples, including Dalits, so they will see more love and less genocide in their lifetimes. So without further ado, here's Arti to introduce our incredible speaker today.
Thank you, Tarina, and thank you all for joining us. Once again, I'm Arti Ferreira, and I'll be your host for this very important conversation about the trauma of caste and how to heal from it. We have a pretty large group that registered today, and I understand many of you may have some questions. If you do, please type them into the chat box, and we will try to get to them at the end if there is time. I understand we have about 1 hour. And with that said, I am honored to introduce Thenmozhi Soundararajan. She is a Dalit American artist, community organizer, and author. She is also the executive director of Equality Labs, which she co-founded in 2015. Equality Labs is a Dalit civil rights organization dedicated to ending caste apartheid, gender-based violence, Islamophobia, white supremacy, and religious intolerance. I understand it's the largest organization of its kind in the United States. And Thenmozhi is also author of the book, The Trauma of Caste. I have it right here with my tabs and everything. We're going to discuss it in detail. I recently read it while traveling in India, and I'm not going to lie, at times it was painful to read about the intergenerational wounds caused by caste, but it's also been eye-opening. It brilliantly provided a psychological and spiritual analysis of caste and how it has persisted and what must be done to abolish it. So I think this book is a must-read, not just for South Asians, but for anyone who cares about human rights, because caste is a human rights issue. And I'm going to just wrap this up. Briefly, I'd like to read a portion of the afterword as part of my introduction of Thenmozhi, because it's just so beautifully written. Thenmozhi Soundararajan is the most profound and prophetic Dalit American voice of the generation. In the face of hatred, she is a love warrior, and in response to trauma, she is a wound healer. Her eloquent language is poetic in character and revolutionary in content. Her vision is local in its roots and global in its routes. In other words, Thenmozhi Soundararajan is a great organic intellectual immersed in the precious and powerful movement for Dalit liberation here and abroad. And welcome, Thenmozhi.
Oh, J Beam and J Savitri, and it's so exciting to be here. I feel like I'm coming home.
Thank you. You know, as an litigator, I always have to start with the foundation. So I know that members of our audience are coming from various backgrounds and may not have a very deep understanding of caste. So let's just start very basic. What is caste?
So thank you for that question. And I think that, for many of us, we often don't have a shared definition because we don't talk about it because there's such a taboo, even though we're trained in it and our nervous systems are also conditioned from it from each of our family lineages. But put simply, caste is a system of exclusion that has its origins in our homelands, many, many centuries ago. And it's based on a social fiction where there are people who are at the topmost classes or castes that basically said everybody else gets to be divided up into degrading levels of purity and professions based on things that happened to them in past lives. So you have Brahmin priests that are at the top, you have Kshatriyas that are the rulers that come next, then you have the Vaishyas who are the merchants and Shudras who are the peasants. And then outside of that traditional caste system, you have castes that were seen as spiritually polluting because to touch them meant that you would get polluted. And they were seen as such because they did crimes in a past life and therefore needed to be sentenced to, an apartheid where they live in separate houses and have separate places of worship. They also experience the worst backbreaking labor and stunning amounts of structural violence and exclusion. And those communities were called untouchable, but that word is seen as an epithet. So instead, we use the term Dalit or many other terms, anything but that term, right? And then you also have
Yes.
indigenous communities that are here that are Adivasi or tribal, and they are also seen as caste oppressed because they're outside of that system and often also face structural exclusion. So that system, which has many different kinds of patterns across South Asia, impacts 1.9 billion people in the world. And, as South Asians have migrated to North America, we are seeing caste recreate itself across many American institutions, from workplaces to universities. And caste oppressed, Americans have, talked about really grave discrimination. And in my work at Equality Labs, we found that 1 in 4 caste oppressed people had experienced physical and verbal assault, 1 in 3 educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. So it's, you don't have to be an expert in the historical reality of caste to know that grave civil rights harms are happening here. And that's really kind of the heart of our conversation in the United States is, what are we going to do in terms of remedying our historical pain, especially as we brought, this process over here and we're seeing it impact American institutions.
Thank you, Thenmozhi. That was a very thorough response, and you actually answered some of the questions I was going to ask you. But I do want to highlight what you said about the carceral nature of caste, that those at the bottom are being punished for sins in a prior life, just so that our audience can understand just how helpless one might feel in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really interesting because, I'm sure as members of SABA, there's a lot of folks that are thinking about different civil rights challenges that South Asian members face, right? And we know that, part of how you deal with grave discrimination is you change the law, right? But, you can change the law, but you also have to change hearts and minds. And I think that's one of the most difficult parts about how we move our community towards healing and reconciliation from caste, because we have to be able to talk about it. We have to be self-reflective about the pain that we carry, both the caste privileged and the caste oppressed around this issue. And what I've found is that, as someone who's caste oppressed, one of the big parts of the wound of caste is really that of being survivors of religious abuse and survivors of this condemnation. Because, I grew up in LA, so I remember when I first had the talk about caste with my mom, one of the things that really haunted me, especially as I was learning about, what it meant to be Dalit or untouchable, was I would just stay awake at night. And I would think about, what crime did I do in another life that I would be sentenced to be untouchable? And to a child's mind, the concept was way too big. And I just kept thinking, and I remember I would I would like fidget and kind of like roll my hands. And I think about, was I a rapist? Was I a murderer? Was I a bad person? And there's a lot of Dalit people and children I've talked to that also struggle with this. And then also the punishment of not feeling like you could properly be in any of our religious or community institutions, because again, as someone who grew up in California, I saw bullying in K through 12. I got harassed as a university when I came out as Dalit. And there's so many aspects of discrimination, from like housing discrimination to wage theft to trafficking. So there are consequences when you're out. And I think that pain of that is really difficult. And so I think, grappling with, as a community, of what it means to have this very precise system of exclusion that tells you not only that you are dehumanized, but you don't even have dignity or a divinity. That really is so just painful. But I think when we have the courage to sit through that discomfort and look at that pain, it can be a portal for reconnection and reconciliation. And I really love, civil rights lawyers like Rhonda McGee, who teaches at University of San Francisco, because she turned to mindfulness and Buddhist practice as part of her litigation and civil rights work, because she saw you have to change the law, but also you need containers for people to grieve and to come back to each other. And that happens when you can create space for more meaningful, grounded conversation. And that was also another part of why I wrote this book, is that, we are in this incredible moment of a caste equity civil rights movement. And we're also seeing nervous systems that have been conditioned very differently about how to talk about caste and how to even be in the same, discourse with each other. And I think this is really our challenge as South Asian civil rights advocates, is how do we be the bridge? How do we practice self-reflection and empathy and kindness in order to heal our community from the wound of caste?
Thank you, Thenmozhi. Parts of your response just gave me goosebumps, and I am going to ask you more about, what it was like for you as a child as you uncovered this painful history. But you also talked about some of the ways that caste affects people. It affects where people live. In South Asia, it can affect access to resources such as running water, literacy and education, career, personal relationships, and in many cases, who you can marry, and also life expectancy. And I heard a talk that you gave, and you mentioned that the average life expectancy for a Dalit woman is 39 years old.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
It was heartbreaking when I saw that number. And I also was really conscious of that because my uncle died of a heart attack at age 40, and he was a lawyer. And, it's funny. I think that, we're not kind to ourselves, and there are ways that our bodies absorb racial and caste stress. And, you guys all know, as lawyers, you're super high performing, you work under pressure, you just kind of suck it in, right? We compartmentalize, we deal with racist work environments, we might deal with racist clients, or casteist clients, or casteist environments. But at the end of the day, you have to deliver, right? But it's at the end of the day, when you finished all your work, that your body unspools all of that pain and pressure, and it takes a toll on our organs. And I was really thinking about that as I wrote this book, because, my mom was diagnosed terminal right as I started writing, with kidney disease. And that's a disease that directly comes from somatic stress. And so I just, you know, the call for healing for us is pretty serious because I think that we are living in deeply polarized times. And oftentimes, you know, those of us that do civil rights work, we're kind of like the guardians and the last, the last bastions of democracy, right? But in the same course, like there are many tools that we can also tie into that are about not just preventing the wolves from coming in, but also learning to de-escalate, learning to approach conflict in ways that are transformative and restorative that might take longer. But if we're able to learn to de-escalate around these polarizing divides, whether they're about race or caste, I think that we might find new pathways for building reconciliation and consensus. And so, you know, that was also part of the call or the challenge in this book is to, are there ways that we can approach historical violence differently? And that trauma that we carry that often, you know, moves us to act through fight or flight or freeze, as opposed to maybe some more slowed down, more conscious, intentional engagements with each other. And that takes practice, you know, but if we're able to practice and build this, we might be able to build unity back where we're seeing such deep violent divides in our community.
Thank you. I recall reading that Equality Labs also does work to end gender-based violence. Can you tell us a little bit about that work that your organization does?
Sure. So, you know, a lot of people may not, you know, especially if you're not experts or do work around caste, but caste has so many different dimensions in terms of society. And one piece that I was really, you know, clued into because I am a Dalit woman was the way that caste operates in terms of interpersonal violence and gender-based violence. And so in many of our members, we saw caste show up in DV cases, for example, where caste was part of the coercive control between the harm-doing partner and the partner that was experiencing abuse. And it would show up in very strange ways. Like, for example, maybe the partner would practice untouchability on the survivor and wouldn't allow them to wash plates or be in parts of the house or insult them with caste slurs. Or it would show up in terms of transnational threats of violence. So they would coerce the survivor into staying, you know, and say, you know, and they would say things like, well, if you act out, I will reach back to our relatives and then I'll make sure that your family gets hurt, because they have caste networks of power with the police or other thugs or the Kap Panchayat or what have you. And a lot of those things were not visible to the people that provide DV services or the police or any of the folks that are working on U visas. So our organization ended up having to kind of do a lot of that translation and building caste equity competency so that folks could better support those survivors. And we also did a lot of work with Dalit women workers who were facing sexual harassment and gender-based violence at work. And we were very lucky to work with the Washington Post to help get an anonymous statement of 30 Dalit women engineers who were experiencing grave caste and gender-based violence in Silicon Valley. So, you know, we do a lot of kind of intersectional work in our work at Equality Labs. It's one of the reasons why I'm a board member of Me Too. And it's, you know, when we're thinking about gender-based violence as an axis of civil rights, you know, needs that need to be addressed, caste is a core part of that. And so, and it happens across all of our South Asian communities and communities of religious practice. And so it's been an amazing place to see survivors go from pain into power by helping them, you know, get out of these conditions, and then they in turn becoming advocates for caste equity.
Thank you. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is caste in the tech industry. People don't talk about it openly, but caste discrimination is prevalent in the tech industry globally and here in the US. So we all know that there's a large population of South Asians working in tech on work visas, but we don't know about how it affects the caste affects the culture because it's taboo to talk about it. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think that in the work that we do around caste and safer workplaces, we have found that while caste exists in all industries, whether it's like agriculture, finance, tech and medical and legal fields, and you name it, tech has been an industry, very intensely impacted by caste because it has a high amount of South Asians. And so in many different, processes, whether it's like discriminatory hiring processes, slurs and harassments, like in the workplace to demotion and termination, we have heard Dalit workers talk about hostile casteist workplaces that are pretty tremendous in terms of some of the barriers to access that they're facing. And that when they reported, HR is like very inconsistent about applying standards to ensure that all workers need to be, given safe access. So I think a big part of our work has been not only helping to organize tech workers and bringing these stories into research and academic and public conversations, but also working with companies directly to get ahead of this problem and conducting DEI workshops. And that's been a really incredible process because we've worked with multiple Fortune 500 companies to really get them to tackle caste, to really see ways that they can make cultures of belonging become more universal as it relates to caste and other protected categories. And the bottom line is that we've seen so much success with that work. And we've seen more Dalits come out in their workplace. We see many entities, celebrating Dalit History Month, and a greater cognition that actually many HR professionals, particularly in transnational companies, feel really overloaded with trying to, manage, global workforces with an American definition of race. And so that's part of where I think, SABA could play a really powerful role, because that competency, especially for companies that have huge South Asian workforces, really needs to be built even stronger. Because, folks may not have known this, but last year I was part of this incident at Google where there were bigots that, deplatformed me from giving a very banal speech actually about caste in the newsroom, which, was supposed to be for a smaller audience in Google News. But bigots outside of that division found out, and they raised a big, hullabaloo inside the company. And people said these really unhinged things like, if this woman speaks, I am afraid for my life. I know, Aarti, I know. And as far as I know, no one has ever died from a DEI talk, but but the fact that level of hysteria and anxiety is being evoked by simply having Dalits speak about their experiences of discrimination shows that, one, shifts in policy are required, pathways to training and awareness also need to be there. And also there is something about the need to build better self-reflection in the conditioning of the nervous systems of the privileged, so that they don't view at a survival level threat in their nervous system a Dalit person speaking about caste and discrimination.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And I'm really happy to hear about the progress that your organization has made in DEI efforts, because, American employers, universities, frankly, any organization or institution with large populations of South Asians should incorporate the topic of caste.
I am 100% with you on this, Aarti.
And you also mentioned Dalit History Month. We're in it right now, and that's why we're that's why we're hosting this event in April. But can you tell us a little bit about how Dalit History Month came to be?
It came out of wanting to have a month where we could celebrate the accomplishments and the joy and the power of caste oppressed people, and really also as a contrast to the depictions of atrocity and deprivation and violence. And, as someone who was always looking for things about Dalit people, it used to be when you used to search the word Dalit, you would just see atrocity images. and that was something that I knew, that our people were more than our wounds. And also, when you know your history, you're able to reach for the stars, right? And I think that, Dalit history is actually all for all of us in South Asia. And I think sometimes when we don't know these figures, we don't know how long we have had conversations for caste and gender equity in the subcontinent. And when we draw on those ancestors, when we draw on those examples and those histories, there's so much palpable inspiration that I think we need, even in a time now when there's so much polarization. I think there's healing in history, and there's healing in celebration. And so I love celebrating it. It feels like a Christmas without the gifts. The gifts is like each other in history. But it really was a holiday and a month I wish I had as a child, when I was so hungry for being seen and being heard, and also wanting to be more than the violence. And I'm so excited to see what we've become.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought it back to when you were a child, because I was really moved by the part of your book you discussed, what it was like for you as a child to discover your caste while growing up in Southern California. And I related to you as the daughter of Indian immigrants, learning about certain aspects of our heritage in school, and then going back to ask my parents for more information. So can you tell the viewers that story that you shared in your book?
Oh, yeah. So, it was funny. I think I was in fifth grade, and I was doing a report on the Bhopal chemical disaster. I don't know if you guys remember that, but it was for me really impactful, because at least in LA, it was the first time on TV, like American TV, that you saw brown people, they see people and they were upset. That wasn't Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but it was like you were seeing brown people, but it was in such a distressing context. And then every time they would cover it, whether it was in magazines or newspapers or on the TV, they would say the biggest group of people were untouchables. And that word really stuck in my mind. I was like, what is an untouchable? This is so bananas. And then, I looked it up in the encyclopedia, and then I read about what the caste system was, and that sounded horrifying. And especially that carceral part, that, it's a crime based on crimes in another life, really stuck with me. And then I just went to my mom really innocently, because I thought, oh, I'm sure that we're the upper caste. And I was like, mom, what caste are we? And she just looked at me, and that look was heartbreaking. And it's why I called it like the talk in the Dalit context, because parents, caste oppressed parents hate talking about caste with their children. And I think that our parents, didn't have access to therapy. And I don't, there's so much emotional intelligence that we've built up here because of what we have access to, and skills and training. That did not happen for my parents. And they were such traumatized people, and they were living in the closet and were not open about their caste identity. And they thought, maybe if we don't talk about it, our child won't know about it. So I kind of think that they just thought if they just closed their eyes and their ears, it would go away. Then all of a sudden, someone that they love the most in their lives just asked them this question and brought it right back. And that's how
Yeah.
trauma works, right? No matter how you try to shove it down, it'll always come back, right? You gotta metabolize it. So I just remember my mom's face and how sad she looked. And she was trying to really distill this very complex concept to her daughter. And I thought she did a good job. She said, like, caste is the lie that the wicked, teach to tell, to be able to take from people. But I think she thought that would just be enough. But it actually spun like a whole other set of questions that I didn't necessarily want to talk with her about, but it really pushed me in my life journey to really think about, like, how could something like this exist? What is happening? And so, and it really shows that children are clued in to issues of moral justice. They want, and they yearn for an understanding of what equity looks like. And at every stage of your development, you'll have the conversation that you're ready for, but it won't stop, especially if you see unending discrimination, which is what I saw. And So I think that fateful conversation really kind of launched me into trying to understand the pain I saw in my family and question why were people in the US practicing things like untouchability or trafficking young Dalit girls, like that really infamous case in Berkeley with, Lucky Bali Reddy, who trafficked 300 workers, including 20 young girls who were his sex slaves, right? I was in school at the same time that that happened. And so when I saw that, and that was one of my first kind of organizing aha moments, it was South Asian women that held the line and supported those survivors, while the rest of the Indian American community sided with that trafficker. And that's why healing is so critical here, because our community might take excellent stances on racial justice, but we are deeply polarized and in pain about this issue of caste. And so being able to create consensus and really center on a place of healing and equity and reconciliation, this is our path right now. And it's been incredible to see so many people really put down the sort of bigotry and join the caste equity movement in a way that's really transformative.
Absolutely, I agree with you, and I commend the work that you're doing. Um, so we talked a little bit, how it all started for you when you were in the 5th grade, but then you went on to UC Berkeley, right? And you did your research on caste while studying there.
Well, no,
And
I actually did my research after Berkeley, but Berkeley was where I saw the Lucky Bali Reddy case and was one of the organizers of that resistance.
okay,
And that kind of was what politicized me. But much later, I worked on and it was one of the founding projects of Equality Labs, was the research we did about documenting caste in the diaspora.
okay, I see. Are you referring to the survey, the 2018 survey?
That's right.
Okay, okay, I see. And what did the study reveal?
Well, I think this is one thing for people in Sabah to know, is that, as people who might be litigators or thinking about policy change, caste oppressed people had a very long journey to being recognized as people who are experiencing grave discrimination in the country. And what I saw, especially as someone who's involved in different campaigns related to caste, and one of the first ones was trying to, make sure that teaching of caste and the word Dalit wasn't erased from California textbooks, which was, been an ongoing point of debate with dominant caste orgs that, do not want caste oppressed people to have civil rights. And I remember that in that campaign, hundreds of Dalits came forward to give testimony. And when I talked to the California board, one of the members of the California Board of Education, she was like, "You guys have excellent testimonies, but you have no data." And when she said that, I really saw that, part of that epistemic divide for caste oppressed people was that if we didn't have, we couldn't translate our pain and our experiences of discrimination into quantifiable numbers, people would not see this as a significant issue. So at that time, we decided, and it was me and several of the other Dalit women founders of Equality Labs, we decided to conduct one of the first surveys around caste discrimination. And this survey was so controversial. Just, and it's not the place that we are now. Like, we are in a place now where people agree caste discrimination exists and we have to do something. At that time, around 2015, 2016, groups were really opposed to talking about caste. And we faced violence even in conducting the survey. So when we would table at religious institutions, at grocery stores and markets, at community events, and people would insult us, they would call us slurs. They would take the iPads that we were collecting data and say, "How dare you split the community?" There was even an org that went into existential crisis over the survey, and they're like, "We can't release the survey. We need to convene our board." And they're like, "If we release this survey, we'll divide our community." And we had to present to the board, data collection is not going to divide a community. The community is already divided because we have Dalit members in your org that are telling us that they feel unsafe. So, just let us, just release the survey. It's not going to say that this org has this, but it'll be part of the data set that we can then collect and build from. And and we had to, really kind of do this level of community-based organizing even to get to that first data set. But once we did, the numbers were tremendous. And as I mentioned earlier, 1 in 4 people experience physical and verbal assault. 1 in 3 experience educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. And because of that, it wasn't surprising that over half of our Dalit respondents said that they would prefer to live in the closet rather than being out. And that was so personal to me because my parents lived in the closet for years. And it's part of what I observed as a child that made me so passionate about wanting to be, to be out as a Dalit person, was I didn't want anybody else to live that life where you're hidden and you're not your full self,
Yes. You talked a little bit about slurs, and in your book you also discussed being a victim of police violence in India. I guess you were there helping a survivor report her case. Can you share that experience with our audience?
Oh, sure. So, I think that a large amount of the reasons why I'm so passionate about addressing caste domestically here in the US is that I did have another part of my life where I worked with organizations in South Asia. And I just saw the pipeline of impunity, and I experienced it physically when I was actually working to document a group of organizers that were trying to help a survivor file what they call an FIR, which is a first information report, which is the first way that you file a case when you've been a victim of a crime. And in that process, the police were so outraged that this survivor had people that were helping her, and they were mad that there was someone filming them that was also a Dalit woman, and they attacked all of us, and they had these long sticks, the latkis, and they beat everybody up. They broke my camera. They hit me on my jaw, on my shoulder, and they chased us out in a car. And I remember, if anyone's ever been like a target of police attack or brutality, there's a moment where the adrenaline just kind of runs in you. You can't even process the shock of what just happened. You're just like in go mode. I need to get out. And for me, I remember processing it like a flash of light, but it was, after that incident, I spent a lot of time thinking about how shocking it was because in that instance, I actually chose not to say anything because my accent would have revealed that I wasn't from the area, which could have brought more violence. So it was this experience of someone beating on me and hitting me, and I couldn't say a word. And I think that was very shocking to my nervous system. And, for like over a year, I couldn't even pick up a camera because I had so much PTSD. And I had to retrain myself how to read and write because my consciousness kind of broke from that trauma. And, and a lot of folks, particularly if you're working with people who've been brutalized, either in interpersonal violence or police violence, a lot of people don't talk about the road to recovery, to reclaim back yourself and your consciousness. And I wanted to write about that because we work with a ton of survivors who blame themselves because they have survived these intense experiences. And when their consciousness is a little bit fractured, they think that, first of all, that you can't recover it, but also they feel ashamed, especially if that impetus of violence came from people who are dehumanizing you as Dalit. So it was important for me to talk about it, also to show that there's a pathway for healing. And also to just know we actually have so many histories of violence amongst us as South Asians. Like sometimes our respectability narrative doesn't allow us to be human with each other and to really address the pains and the wound that we carry. But when we can be open and honest with each other, I think so much shifts,
Yeah. That experience in India, it just sounds terrifying, and it resonates with me as someone who also, I have an accent. My Hindi is not very good. So when I go there, you feel helpless. And that's why I really admire your bravery for going out there to help. I remember also that you mentioned when you received the Racial Justice Award from Sabah in 2020, that was actually the first time that I heard of you, and I was just captivated by your energy. So that's why I jumped at the opportunity. But I remember you also mentioned receiving death threats and being in a witness protection program.
Oh, not a witness protection program, but in the
Okay.
wake of that Google incident that we talked about,
Mhm.
because both me and, the other impacted person there was the worker and manager Tanuja Gupta,
Mhm.
also an incredibly amazing Desi civil rights leader, because she fought to get Dalit History Month reinstated and broke the silence about the systemic caste discrimination. She was retaliated against by management. And the attack was so severe that she resigned in a very public way and then outed the experience to the Washington Post.
Oh.
And that from that moment, it was kind of a circus between the both of us where we both faced extreme violence and threats for over 2 months. And people tried to attack me, they tried to attack my parents. And I had to live in a safe house for 2 months so that people wouldn't come and hurt my elderly parents. And all of this because we wanted to talk about caste equity, right? And that's a big reason why we have been fighting to add caste as a protected category in jurisdictions everywhere, whether it's companies and universities or cities and states. And, we just had this big win in Seattle, and we're now launching this incredible new bill called SB 403 with, California State Senator Aisha Wahab. And it's an incredible historical moment. And I'm so grateful that Saba has taken this powerful stand for caste equity, because you should have heard the room when everybody heard that Saba was making that statement in Seattle. I think there was like cheers from all over the country. And, you're going to see those same cheers when people see that letter for California, because this is a civil rights movement that is uniquely our own as South Asians. And I think there's something about the ways that we build power. When we change policy like this, we're not just changing a couple of words in the law, we're actually acknowledging intergenerational harm. And we're coming together and saying, look, bad things happen, but guess what? We know how to fix it. Let's come together. Let's reconcile. Let's heal. And I think that's tremendous. And I've been so, with a statewide bill like this, like basically every weekend, I'm in some new city in the state. So I was in Yuba City or Sacramento or Fresno or Bakersville and Bakersfield or San Francisco or the Shastas. But every part of the state, you have Desis that are thrilled that caste equity is coming. So I think it's just a profound moment, and it's a very historical thing for us to be doing as South Asians. And I'm just so glad that like Saba is part of this wonderful history.
I absolutely agree with you. I'm thrilled about the prospect of SB 403, and it would just make me so proud as a Californian and a South Asian to see this go
Yes.
forward. Yes. So thank you for your work on that. And yeah, I think we can move our discussion now to talk about what some of us upper caste members or privileged people, I think they're referred to as Savarna, right? Is that how you
Yes.
pronounce it? Yes, I learned a lot of vocabulary from your book. Because you're right, you discussed ignorance by upper caste members, and that is a result of privilege. And every system of oppression has people who are privileged. And thanks to you and your book, like I can recognize now that I am one of them, and I'm going to do what you encouraged your readers to do in your book. But first, I guess I want to tell you about my recent trip to India. I was reading your book, and I hope to conduct my own investigation about caste. But it was really tough because I encountered many roadblocks. I attempted to have conversations about caste with relatives living in India, and at times I was struck with disappointment by self-interested or superficial responses that I got. Like making the issue about reservations, which is India's affirmative action system, and how it affects people on the top rather than caste, and how it affects people on the bottom. So in meditation 2 of your book, in the section on Savarna fragility, you suggest that caste privileged people need to understand caste identity by claiming caste as a way to abolish it. And so, I know that I belong to the Kshatriya caste and that I have received many benefits from it. And I know that members of my caste have created harm for caste oppressed people. And I will consider that harm as I work to commit to the freedom of all caste oppressed peoples and make sure that I do no further such harm. And, it's a small, it doesn't seem like much, but, it's a start that can provide an opportunity for dialogue and raise awareness about oppression in our community. And as privileged people, we have a moral duty to act or speak when we see someone being treated unfairly.
That's amazing, Aarti. That's such a kind and, just a beautiful act of grace, and I guess, part of what the emotion behind those words is really profound, because I think that that's actually one of the biggest barriers. I feel like, because all of us, taking aside the process of caste, all of us have experiences being people who are privileged on one issue or oppressed on the other. And I think one of the challenges of the trauma that, privileged bodies have around, whatever system of exclusion you're looking at, is being able to be still enough to sit with the grief of complicity, of guilt, the awkwardness, that discomfort. And that's that's what I think is so amazing, is that these are just all conditions of a state of mind. So they're not who we are, but if we can actually just sit and look at them just as frankly as you did, it can be like, yes, it's true. Some things happened in the past that gave me certain privileges. And guess what? I'm not okay with it. And I'm also okay to let it go, because it's not ultimately who I am. I have the ability to look at that legacy and say, I want to learn from it, and also commit to taking it apart so that it never happens to someone else. And just so those simple words, like it's like birds released from your soul, right? You're like, I'm free. Because
Yeah.
you might lose a perceived privilege, but in fact, you gain your humanity and you gain connection with so many other people you didn't know. And that's what I found, because we have this Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop with Equality Labs, and I saw a lot of dominant caste people would come into that workshop really ashamed or struggling with things that they saw in their families or their contexts. And I think a lot of what our team just would try to provide was comfort and grace and opening, saying, yes, this happens, and you know what, we're not alone. Like, South Asians have this particular dominator system, but guess what, there are many dominator systems that societies have had to struggle through. And the way that we move through it is we loosen our attachment to that version of the world, and we rebuild our connections with each other. So I just love that offering you gave to folks, Aarti, because it was so genuine and kind, and I think we all felt it.
Thank you. So I just have a couple more topics I want to get through before we move on to questions. The topic of healing, a good portion of your book focuses on healing, which I think makes it really unique and a worthwhile read. What would you like to share with our audience about how to heal from caste?
Oh, well, the great thing about the book is that it has tons of workshops around that, worksheets that help you. Because I think a large amount of what's difficult around caste is that it's kind of like the water that we swim in, but nobody tells us that we're in the water. So there's things that your family might be doing that are deeply part of their caste lineage, but they just thought, okay, if I don't say it, it's just what you understand as South Asian. So that could be things like the sacred thread or the Janyu, or, I remember talking to someone, and she she was like, she stopped hanging out with this friend that she knew who was Brahmin in Chicago because they had 2 kitchens. And so only the Brahmins could only use, the family could use one kitchen and everyone else used the other kitchen because they didn't want to cross pollute. And she thought, when she found that out, it kind of like gave her a bad taste in the mouth. Or, you know, things like you see, like a lot of times caste comes up in like interpersonal relationships, right? So it's only when you have those kind of like fissures that you suddenly realize something is operating, but we don't have enough language for. So that's part of why I gave those worksheets, because then you could start to ask questions. And as you saw in your conversations with your family, sometimes that first conversation doesn't really go well. But I think what you're doing, especially when you hit things like trauma, is you have to be iterative, you have to be kind, you know, you don't want to ask when someone's escalated, but slowly pieces come out. And then all of a sudden you hear the stories like, oh, that aunt that married someone that wasn't from a good family, and that's why people don't like hang out with her anymore. Or what happened in the context of, you know, why someone is so against affirmative action in India because they saw something, or someone is caste oppressed who left that behind and is like living in the closet. You know, there are many details of our life that when you start to unwind them, you understand, oh, it's connected to caste. It comes from this process. So being able to do that self-work, that self-healing, actually then allows you to be a better collaborator in interpersonal contexts, and then even later on in terms of structural work. Because like all systems of exclusions, there are interventions you can make on the internal, the interpersonal, and the structural. And I think our goal is to basically bring that into a pathway where you can just think about the fact that you're going to be unlearning caste your whole life, but you'll find different openings and possibilities in these different contexts.
Thank you. So I see that we have less than 10 minutes left, and we do have some questions. Let's see. I see a question from Anuradhika. It says here, could we know a little more about the Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop that Equity Labs holds? Are there any proposed dates for the workshop this year?
We will be having those dates and we'll announce them off of our social media handles. I think our next one will probably be in May or June. So just take a look out for that. You can follow us on Equality Labs and we'll share it. I'm sorry I didn't come with the official dates, but I think we're kind of moving it around based on the SB 403 bill. So a lot of our organizers are also part of that training process as well. But think May, June, you'll find it.
Thank you. And there's also a question from Aziza. She says, my understanding is the caste system in India is rooted in Hinduism. Is there a reason you have not mentioned Hinduism's role?
Well, I think that it's important to understand caste really in the modern sense is found now in all religions, you know, and that's what I actually wrote about in this book. I'm someone who was born Hindu and Christian, saw caste in both of those communities of practice. And really the way that we're seeing it, even in the United States, it's a function of it being its own separate system of exclusion. So I don't think it's worthwhile to really take this into the conversation of the religious domain when it's really its own human and civil rights problem. And you know, in the movement related to caste, it's very strongly caste equity, it's interfaith, it's intercaste, and it's multiracial, because you have survivors of caste discrimination across all of these different communities of religious practice. So, you know, I'm not interested necessarily in, you know, getting into like a scriptural debate or, you know, a religious conversation, because religion is already covered as a protected category. However, with caste, we need to clarify those existing protections for caste suppressed people because of the kinds of grave discrimination we're seeing from like trafficking to wage theft to discriminatory workplaces to sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And so for those purposes, it's really, and even in the UN governmental standard related to caste, it's really all about focusing on the system that exists now and how we can, remedy the discrimination coming from it.
Thank you. And I see a final question from Neha Shah, who's also on our racial. It says here, putting on my labor and employment lawyer and workplace investigator hats, could you identify some specific conduct between the victim and oppressor to look for when investigating claims of caste discrimination? Could you also talk about what caste discrimination might look like outside of South Asian communities?
So that is a great question. And just to give you guys some context, there is a distinction between the way caste operates as a social phenomenon. Looks like someone named ST also has a question. So I don't mind staying a little bit longer to answer that question. So, but caste as a social phenomenon in South Asia is actually different than caste as the protected characteristic, because caste as a protected characteristic goes wider than South Asian communities, and it actually impacts any communities that are impacted by discrimination based on birth, work, and descent. So you have caste oppressed communities that experience similar hierarchies like the South Asian caste system in Japan, in Korea, in the continent of Africa, as well as Latin America. And so you see in American case law many instances of people who are experiencing, discrimination who are from the Somali caste oppressed communities, or the Korean or Japanese caste oppressed communities. So it is important, I think, from a legal perspective, and especially if you're someone doing HR or HR investigation, people who might claim the category of caste is definitely broader than South Asian. And we have many instances of people that have brought that up in many different branches of law, from immigration to discrimination and other forms of litigation. In terms of HR investigation, the kinds of things that we've heard are actually textbook workplace, violations and HR, things that make up a hostile workplace. So bullying and harassment. So a very common thing we've seen in companies has been the open usage of caste slurs. And in fact, there was recently a case that was just adjudicated by the British Colombian Human Rights Commission, where a taxi cab worker was given close to $10,000 in a settlement because of the use of slurs from his fellow taxi cab drivers, and that they used that as a reason to not pay him the same equal wages as himself. And it's one of the first cases of its kind in North America. So if you see that, the person who's experienced harm being targeted because of their caste background, and there's activity based on that, whether it's bullying and harassment, slurs, being passed over for promotions, discriminatory hiring processes, sexual harassment or bullying, I think usually those caste oppressed people will speak to that. And I remember talking to this one worker who was in New York, and her coworker, she's in tech, asked her what her caste was. And she said, "Oh, I'm Valmiki. I'm from, one of the Dalit castes." And the next day when she was reviewing her work product, she said, "Oh, you are," she said that, "Oh, your people are so mindless. I can't believe you did this. This was just a terrible job." And then the immediate next day she fired her. So it's like she elicited information about her caste in order to kind of, find kind of a weak point in her, and then use that in a slur as she then kind of berated her about her work product and then shut it down, So I hope that that helps. And it looks like there's some question in the Q&A. Do you see that, Aarti?
Yeah, Salil, she said there was a question, but the question I saw was, will you also share the recording later? I don't know if there's another question that I missed, because I think we are going to share the recording later, but is there,
I'll
right?
bring it up. It's in the Q&A. Dear Thenmozhi, how do you deal with complaints and propaganda of entities, and I'm not going to name the entities, of from like the Hindu nationalistic camp, insisting that the struggle against caste is Hindu phobia and criticizing caste as somehow hating Hindus. Most non-Desis don't even know these differences. What is your response to that?
Well, I think that, every civil rights struggles have those that feel uncomfortable by the flow of progress. And I don't want to speak too much about those opponents because, as we talked earlier, those feelings come from discomfort and fragility and the appearance of the loss of power. If all of a sudden those that have been oppressed kind of can be at the same field of equity with them. But I will say that it's not uncommon to try to, I don't know if you guys have heard of this term called DARVO. It comes out of domestic violence. It was developed by a psychologist to talk about this phenomenon that happened in DV and sexual assault cases where perpetrators of harm would basically, and the DARVO stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And I think that's what I see in something like, that claim, because, the only people that caste equity changes and policy impact are those that discriminate. If you don't discriminate, you're not going to have a problem. However, I think it really helps to muddy the water and also intimidate people by using terms like that, because it makes it look as if, one group is being targeted. But in fact, many of the advocates for caste equity are actually Hindu Dalits. And this is not, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't a religious issue. This is actually a civil rights issue. And it's a human rights issue. And it's why these movements are intercaste and interfaith and multiracial. So I think that, yes, there are opponents to civil rights, but I actually think there's a greater degree of South Asians and Americans that don't want any significant discrimination to occur at all, especially when you're seeing the kinds of things that we're seeing, which is like wage theft, trafficking, bullying and harassment, and sexual harassment. So I feel like, just like we had to deal with those birthing pains that led to the Civil Rights Act and Title VII and Title IX, we will see this kind of tumult, but we're winning, and we've won so many institutions so far. And it's really up to all of us to kind of really help move our communities from pain to power and move to healing around this issue. And conversations like this are a big part of us building those bridges of reconciliation and an accounting of harms related to caste, but also pathways we might heal.
Thank you very much. And if there are no further questions, I thought, yes,
I'll close up if you don't mind, Aarti.
sure. I just had one more positive exercise that I was hoping
let's do a
everyone.
positive exercise sounds
Yes,
good.
yes. I thought it would be nice if we could all, type one thing into the chat box, one thing that we can do to support the cause for Dalits. And I also wanted to play a song if I can figure it out after Tara closes up.
And maybe I can close up and you can certainly play the song. No issues, Aarti. But I just want to say thank you to Thenmozhi for her efforts to educate the South Asian and other legal organizations across the United States and Canada on this very, very important issue. And, I think it's important to note, and maybe Thenmozhi, you can put a link to where people can find Trauma of Caste. I think that's important. If you're willing to put that in the chat, I think it'll be good for our organization as well as the ABA's section on civil rights and social justice, who have co-sponsored this event, to kind of get an idea of where they can find more information about this subject. And I think it's safe to say Thenmozhi is the kind of foremost authority on caste discrimination issues. And as she indicated during this webinar, there's much more work to be done, but there's a lot more healing that we need to do as a community. And we look forward to further partnerships with Thenmozhi as we go forward in our quest. Arthi, you can finalize, you can finish it off with whatever you'd like to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Thenmozhi. It's really been a pleasure to have this opportunity to engage in dialogue with you. Keep fighting the good fight, and let's see what the future holds. And
Oh, there
stay
is a
optimistic.
last minute question, and I think
Okay.
I feel like we should ask it. There is a dire need to talk about caste in the university DEI communities we belong to in the face of all other hard work that still needs to happen. Do you have advice on how to bring the need to add caste discrimination to the agenda? Thank you for your incredible work.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, we're working with 100 institutions across the country to add caste as a protected category. So, if you don't mind, you can reach out. You can just find me. I'll type in my email and I'll connect you to our university organizers. We actually have a team of lawyers that actually help people walk through that process, because every university is its own kind of little cabal of, bureaucracy. But you'd be surprised, like now that Harvard and Brown has done this, and of course we got this incredible win with the Cal State University system. It's no longer about being in the front of the pack. It's really about like you're in the safe middle. So if you at a conservative university, it's really a moment where you might be able to move the needle in a way that you wouldn't have thought before. So love to help with that, and I'm so excited for you to reach out.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you coming today and joining SABA North America's Racial Justice Task Force. Arthi, thank you. You did a wonderful job of connecting us to Thenmozhi and getting us to the stage. And we look forward to presenting more in the months to come on different issues. And keep in touch with us. We are advocating on behalf of the community on racial justice issues, including caste, as Thenmozhi knows. And we are hopeful that we can continue this partnership as we go forward in years to come. So thank you and have a good night.
And happy Dalit History Month, J Beam and J Savitri, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Love you all.
Bye.
Okay, bye.